Now I forget which member of the first Trump administration it was who said that Donald Trump is incapable of learning anything. He doesn't read, he doesn't take advice, he just plays everything by gut instinct, fails to gain wisdom with experience, never changes his mind much. Because mostly he's all output and no input. At least no input that provokes any sort of reflection. We might have hoped that was not true, to the extent that when we learned how badly the Alaska summit between Trump and Putin actually went behind the scenes, which I discussed on Friday, that he would have at least learned from that Vladimir Putin does not want peace. We might have hoped that since President Zelensky has successfully and with stoic determination built a better-tempered relationship with the American president, that Trump might be more inclined to understand his and his country's position. And immediately following his latest call with Vladimir Putin, Trump was apparently much more positive for the prospects of a peace deal, riding on the crest of the Middle East wave as he was. Now that, of course, was before we'd gotten the details of the call he just had. But right now, as those details start to emerge, the voices that said, nah, he's incapable of learning, he totally bears the bum print of the last person who sat on him, they seem to be validated, because Trump has just slotted right back to square one. The Washington Post reported yesterday that on the Trump-Putin call on Thursday, Putin had done what he consistently does, demanded that Ukraine surrender full control of the Donetsk region to Russia. No change there. You may recall that one of the main objections to that plan, apart from the very basic objection that who are you to be demanding another country's territory at all, but one of the other objections is that the geography of that region provides an effective defendable bulwark against Russia invading the rest of the country. Strategically speaking, giving that up would be the dumbest thing Ukraine could voluntarily agree to, pretty much guaranteeing that any supposed peace bought as a result would be fragile and short-lived. Nevertheless, following that phone call and his subsequent meeting with President Zelensky, Trump backtracked on his previous musing that he might sell Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine via Europe, and instead retreated to his simplistic chants of the past. It's time to stop the killing, he said, and make a deal. Enough blood has been shed with property lines being defined by war and guts. They should stop where they are. Let both claim victory. Let history decide. You'd have to think there's a pretty good chance that history will decide that that was an outstandingly nonsensical contribution to this particular historical moment. But I guess it does kind of depend on who gets to write the history. Apparently, in the phone call, Vladimir Putin made the supposed concession that if he got the whole of Donetsk, then he might be willing to surrender parts of two other regions that his forces partly occupy, Zaporizhzhia and Kherson. This is like saying that whereas he was going to amputate both your legs, he's prepared to make a concession to you and leave part of your left leg above the knee. Would that sound like a great concession to you? No, didn't think so. It does apparently sound like an absolutely great idea to President Trump, who, according to a story published by the Financial Times just as this video was being shot, pushed Zelensky during the Friday meeting to accept Russia's terms for ending the war, otherwise known as surrender. Trump had been persuaded by Putin that he would destroy Ukraine if it didn't agree to this. The Friday meeting descended into a shouting match, with Trump cursing all the time, according to the FT. Trump apparently tossed aside maps of the front line, saying he was sick of seeing them, and insisting that Zelensky surrender Donbass to Putin. It turned out that the best that Zelensky was able to do with that situation was to finally win Trump back to at least the freeze the border where it is position, which is what was reflected in Trump's subsequent tweet. And Trump had accepted many of Putin's other talking points verbatim. Trump reportedly told Zelensky the conflict was, wait for it, a special operation, not even a war, and that Russia's economy is doing just great, in contrast with what was previously said by, well, yes, President Trump, giving the Ukrainians yet another exciting opportunity to develop their skills of self-restraint in the face of provocation, industrial levels of stupidity. This reflects Putin's obvious strategy with Trump. Win him over to a position that Putin knows Ukraine can never accept, and hence get him to blame Ukraine for the war's continuation, and hopefully hence pull the support of America from Ukraine to Russia's benefit. Unsurprisingly, Ukraine is not buying either. Zelensky left the White House and said this: Ukraine will never grant terrorists any bounty for their crimes, and we count on our partners to uphold this very position. So now we have a situation where Trump and Putin have committed to meet again for another summit. What's going to be different this time compared to the last? Unknown. There are no obvious differences in position on either side. The most interesting question in relation to the summit in Budapest, Hungary, that has even been asked so far is what route is President Putin going to take to get there, given that he has a warrant out for his arrest from the International Criminal Court. Seems likely he will end up having to take a very circuitous route to take him probably over Turkey, keeping well away from the Black Sea, adding several hours to his flight time. To do what? Trump, of course, has no authority to offer up Ukraine's surrender. He apparently has no interest in pushing that Russia should accept that it can't demand more of Ukraine's territory. The only thing you can suggest is that Putin indicated on that phone call to Trump that maybe he was too unbending in Alaska. Maybe Russia will settle for the current lines, which he'll tell Trump, of course, will then be the end of it. But of course he'll be doing so with a clear view in mind as to his next step. So you could expect that those negotiations would also come with Russia vociferously objecting to any European presence in Ukraine in the form of a post-war security guarantee. There's nothing public to indicate that even that much of a fallback is actually Putin's position. But if it were, it could be what has made Trump think that now a deal is possible, more so than it was. But it could just as easily be that Trump never learns. On the call with Putin, Putin spent a long period of time flattering him, telling him all the things he loves to hear about himself, and that simply made Trump convinced that this time, Vladimir wouldn't pull the football away just as he's about to kick it. In the meantime, it's worth noting that the Ukrainian who was arrested on the belief that he had been involved in blowing up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline carrying Russian gas to Germany, he was let free by a Polish court. Germany had requested the suspect Volodymyr Zhuravlyov to be extradited to Germany. But the judge ruled otherwise. He said that the context of the war in Ukraine made it completely different to such a case in any other circumstance, noting that Russia's invasion had been, quote, a bloody and genocidal attack, from which Ukraine had the legal right to self-defense. If Ukraine and its special forces organised an armed mission to destroy enemy pipelines, which the court does not prejudge, then these actions were not unlawful. On the contrary, they were justified, rational and just. Caused something of a surprised reaction in the court. It was welcomed by Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, who said this: the problem with Nord Stream 2 was its construction, not its blowing up, no matter how brutal these words may sound and upset some Germans. You would think President Trump would have some sympathy with this. After all, the United States as well is under attack from what they describe as the terrorist wing of the Democratic Party, the pro-Hamas wing, the Antifa faction, who Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt described as Hamas terrorists, illegal aliens and violent criminals. The self-same people who this weekend have been rocking America to its core with peaceful protest? But that's okay, because while brushing off President Zelensky's request for long-range weapons to strike at Russia's war machine deep within its own territory, President Trump has been responding to the domestic emergency by posting AI-generated videos of him dumping excrement on peaceful protesters, which changes your perspective on the fact that Donald Trump is incapable of learning anything from anybody, because that might well just be a good thing. After all, Vladimir Putin could teach him quite a lot about how a serious dictator responds to peaceful protests in his own country.